practice more.
Indie animation discourse is broken because nobody knows whether they're watching a pilot, a promise, a product, or someone else's life's work. And that sounds dramatic, but I genuinely think that's the core issue behind all this recent arguing around shows like Gameoverse, Planetronika, The Amazing Digital Circus, and the entire modern indie animation boom. Because right now, people will watch an indie animated pilot and judge it like it's a Netflix-funded season finale with 45 executives, a full production pipeline, and 3 seasons of emotional context behind it. But then, the second somebody criticizes the same pilot, the defenders will act like the creator is a small Victorian child coughing into a fucking blanket who must be protected from all negativity. So now indie creators are stuck in this impossible middle ground. Too big to be treated like hobbyists, too independent to be judged like corporations, and too accessible to escape fandom entitlement. That's the real problem. Indie animation doesn't need less criticism, it needs a better criticism from audiences who understand the difference between a pilot, a passion project, and a corporate product. Not stop criticizing indie animation, not let creators do whatever with no standards, and it's definitely not every indie project is automatically good because somebody worked hard on it. The point is that the conversation has become media illiterate in opposite directions. One side treats indie artists like soulless megacorporations, the other side treats soulless megacorporations like indie artists. And because nobody can agree on what the fuck is the correct standard, every pilot becomes a battlefield. A battlefield over what audiences are owed, what creators deserve, and whether criticism is support or detriment. That's why Gameoverse and Planetronika are interesting to talk about to me. Not because I think they're punching bags, not because I think they represent the entire medium, but because they are not being judged as solely cartoons. They're being judged as symbols of where indie animation is going. And that's why the discourse around them feels so messy, defensive, horny, moralized, and personal.
I shook up the world!
Let's start with the pilot conversation because this is where people start lying to themselves in both directions. Do indie animated pilots actually need a story to be good? My answer is not exactly. A pilot does not need to explain the entire lore. A pilot does not need to resolve every character arc. A pilot does not need to prove the entire series in one episode. A pilot does not need to become a mini-movie, but a pilot does need to communicate a promise. That promise can be the emotional engine of the show. It can be the central character dynamic. It can be the tone. It could be the world. It could be the conflict. It could be the comedy style. It could be all of those. It could be the kind of episode we should expect if this becomes a series. So the better question is not, did this pilot give me the whole story? The better question is, did this pilot teach me how to watch the show? Because those are two very different standards. A slice of life pilot can be good without a massive plot if the characters, rhythm, comedy, and world are strong enough. If the point of the pilot is to say, this is the vibe, this is the friendship, this is the kind of chaos that you're signing up for, then it doesn't need to suddenly turn into Attack on Titan Episode 1 to prove that it has depth. But quote unquote, it'll be revealed later is not a magic shield either. Mystery only works when the immediate experience is engaging. You can hide the lore, you cannot hide the hook. You can delay answers, you cannot delay audience investment forever. If episode 1 doesn't explain the villain's full backstory, that's fine. If episode 1 doesn't make me care about the characters, that's a problem. That's why I think that the argument around Gameoverse is different than the argument around Planetronika. Gameoverse has a very clear conceptual engine. It's an animated project from Ross O'Donovan that spent a very long time in development, and its premise is basically about video game worlds, heroes, villains, and this larger conflict where saving reality may require approaching that hero-villain dynamic in a way that feels flipped or morally complicated. That is an actual hook. That is a promise. That tells you what kind of dramatic contradiction the show wants to explore. Planetronika, on the other hand, seems to be working from a very different place. It is much more vibes forward. It feels more like a colorful, expressive adventure cartoon premise about characters going through strange mishaps around alien planets. It is aiming for that Y2K cartoon energy, character appeal, episode charm, and that specific feeling of older cartoons more than a hard serialized prestige drama engine. And honestly, With Planetronika, my favorite thing about the pilot is easily the aesthetic. When most shows try to emulate the 2000s style, it comes off as half-assed. It feels like someone remembered the color palette, the big shapes, the chunky design language, but forgot the actual rhythm of those cartoons. Planetronika is one of those rare cases where it actually replicated the feeling of those old cartoons almost perfectly. The character designs have that loud, expressive, instantly readable silhouette language, the backgrounds feel colorful without becoming visual mush. The voice direction was really good too, honestly. It's like a cartoon that could have existed in this weird transitional era between Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and like Newgrounds or in early internet animation. What didn't particularly sell me was the story and by proxy, the pacing. And I know that not everything has to have this grand or serious plot, especially if it's promoted as a slice of life. I'm not saying every indie pilot needs to open with lore tablets, a dead parent, and like a war criminal monologuing over a fucking blood moon, okay? But the concept of adventures and mishaps on alien planets felt somewhat sabotaged by the sheer amount of things happening at once. The pilot has energy, it has style, it has appeal, but I think it would hit way harder if each episode had a better established beginning, middle, and end, with a more centralized premise. Because a slice of life cartoon still needs structure. It doesn't have to be serious, it doesn't really have to be deep, but it does need to feel like the episode knows what the main situation is, especially if it's trying to harken back to the 2000s animation era. That's why I keep coming back to this idea. A pilot does not need to answer every question, but it does need to prove the questions are worth asking. So if you judge Gameoverse and Planetronika by the exact same standard, you're already doing a bad criticism. If Gameoverse is presenting itself as a lore-heavy action-adventure with stakes, then yes, the pilot should probably communicate the core conflict early enough and clearly enough that viewers understand why they should follow the series. If Planetronika is presenting itself as a stylish, episodic, expressive cartoon about space adventures, strange planets, and character-driven mishaps, then the critique should be less, where is the overarching prestige drama storyline, and more, did this short establish a strong enough recurring episode engine? That's the difference. A pilot does not need to answer every question, but it does need to provide the questions that are worth asking. This is where the internet gets annoying, because one side acts like every single thing has to be explained immediately or the writing is bad, and the other side acts like any confusion or emptiness or lack of setup can be hand-waved away with, just wait, it'll be revealed later, or this story is a slice of life, it doesn't need a story. And I think both of those arguments are lazy. Gradual storytelling is real. Setup and payoff are real. Mystery is real. You should not need the entire cosmology of a show explained in episode 1 like a fandom wiki entry with voice acting. But there is a difference between intentional withholding and just not giving the audience enough information to chew on. A good pilot makes you ask questions because you're invested. A weak pilot makes you ask questions because you're unsure of what the point even was. Those are not the same. And this is where a lot of indie animation discourse gets emotionally charged. Because when a creator has spent years developing something, fans treat patience like a moral obligation. They'll say, you can't judge it yet, you don't know where it's going, and you need to let them cook. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes let them cook becomes a way to avoid admitting that the appetizer was cold. And this connects to another criticism I've been seeing a lot lately, especially with Gameoverse, the therapy speak criticism. Characters deliver these cathartic, deeply personal, often excessive monologues aimed at or spoken by characters we barely know anything about yet. And honestly, I get the criticism. It's easy to fall into. I see this in a lot of indie projects, and I've been criticized for it myself. But when you're an independent creator, especially if the work is personal, it is very easy to rush straight into the emotional thesis. You want the audience to understand the trauma, the growth, the inner conflict, the meaning, the whole this is what the story is really about moment. But if the audience has only known the character for 10 fucking minutes, that emotional release can feel unearned. Not because the idea is bad, not because emotional writing is inherently bad, but because catharsis needs buildup. If a character starts acting like they've reached the climax of their arc, their season 2 finale, then it can feel less like character writing and more like the writer is trying to force me into caring. And I don't want to spend too much time on that here because this is not really a video about writing, but it is relevant to the pilot conversation because quote unquote, it'll be revealed later is not the only problem. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes a pilot tries to reveal its emotional core too early because the audience has enough time to earn that feeling naturally. A pilot is not a finale, but it is a handshake, it's an agreement. It's the creator saying, this is what I'm offering, will you tune in for the rest? And the audience is allowed to say, okay, I understand what you're offering, or I don't think this worked yet. That is not entitlement by itself. That's just criticism. Now we need to talk about the dumbest but also the most revealing part of this whole discourse, the term goon bait, because that word is getting thrown around way too lazily. And I want to be clear here, I do think that Gameoverse and Planetronika have a forward amount of fan service in them. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that certain shots, certain angles, certain expressions, and certain cuts of animation were not designed to elicit a very specific feeling from the audience. I think the people posting the meme words, no, just a girl, oh my god, it's pure goon slap, it's kind of disingenuous. Like, you know that they know what they're doing, right? But let's be adults. A female character having curves does not automatically make a show goon bait. A character having confidence in feeling themselves does not automatically make a show goon bait. A suggestive pose, a stylized design, an attractive silhouette, or a horny camera angle does not automatically mean the entire project is porn-brained. But I'm not gonna completely dismiss what people are reacting to either, because sometimes the framing is the point. Sometimes the expression is the point. Sometimes the way the shot is drawn, timed, or angled is very clearly trying to make you feel something. And if we're gonna have an honest conversation about fan service, we can't act like the camera is innocent when it's clearly not. The issue is when people reduce the entire appeal of a show to just that. Actual goon bait in my eyes is when the media is designed primarily around sexual stimulation, thirst traps, fetish farming, or endless teasing instead of meaningful characters, comedy, story, or world building. So, with characters like Kit from Gameoverse or Butterfly from Planetronika, the real question should not be, is this character attractive? I think that's overly simplified. The question should be, is this character being solely reduced to sex appeal, or does she still have agency, personality, function, and a reason to exist within the product itself? Because fan service is not automatically bad. Stylized exaggeration is not automatically bad. Cartoons have had exaggerated bodies, shapes, movements, and attitudes. That is part of the medium. Especially when a project is clearly pulling from Y2K animation, Newgrounds energy, anime influence, like MTV style edge, Jet Set Radio-ish attitude, like that whole early 2000s, mid 2000s vibe. But fans also should not play dumb when the camera is clearly inviting that kind of attention. That's where the honest middle ground is. You can say this design has fan service, that's cool. You can say the shot is clearly framed to be suggestive, I think you would be right. You can say this character's appeal is partly sexualized, I think you would be right. You could even say this fan service is distracting from the tone of the scene. In Gameoverse's case, I think you would be right. But that is not the same as saying the whole show has no value beyond gooning. And this is where the difference between Gameoverse and Planetronika becomes really important, because Planetronika is way more forward with it. It permeates throughout the entire pilot way more openly than it does in Gameoverse. The show knows what it is in that aspect. It's colorful, loud, expressive, stylish, horny as fuck, and almost proud of that fact. And I don't mean that as an insult. It has that unabashed, slightly shameless cartoon confidence where a show clearly cares about being fun, stylish, expressive, and attractive, but that does not seem embarrassed by the fact that it's horny. It's baked into the presentation. So whether you like it or not, at least the tone feels consistent. You kind of have to know what you're getting into, and it's an acquired taste. Gameoverse, on the other hand, is different because it's trying to treat itself like a serious story. It wants emotional weight. It wants drama. It wants these heavier character moments. So when the visual fanservice shows up in scenes that are supposed to be serious and grounded, it can become distracting in a different way. Like that scene where the dinosaur Gobbles is basically telling Kit that she never did anything wrong. Aside from how I feel about the dialogue of that scene, the shot choices and angles make it harder to fully sit in that emotional weight of the moment because you're literally just seeing her ass. That's a total clash in my opinion. The show wants me to focus on vulnerability and catharsis. And that's one problem in itself because we've known the character for 15 minutes. But the framing is still pulling attention towards the fan service. And that's not me saying, how dare this cartoon have attractive characters. That's not what I'm saying. That's me saying that the visual language and the emotional intent of the scene are fighting each other. That's the difference. With Planetronika, the horniness is part of the texture. With Gameoverse, it can sometimes feel like the horniness interrupts the texture. And that's why the quote-unquote goon bait conversation needs more nuance. Fan service is seasoning. Goon bait is when the seasoning becomes the meal. And this is where the conversation starts getting even more annoying because now the quote-unquote goon bait debate is slowly turning into a culture war. I'm seeing grifters make videos about this. The second people start arguing about whether Butterfly from Planetronika is too sexualized, my feed starts getting videos like, the war on straight sexuality. And that's how you know this conversation is cooked. Because at that point, we are no longer talking about whether the character design is effective, whether the camera is being too horny, whether the show uses fan service well, or whether the pilot has pacing issues. Now the conversation has been hijacked by people who need every cartoon woman with a body to become evidence in some massive ideological courtroom drama. And that's exhausting, because there is a real conversation to be had here. There is a conversation about fan service. There's a conversation about whether indie animation is leaning too hard on horny character appeal to grab attention. There is a conversation about whether audiences are getting worse at recognizing the difference between sexualization, stylization, and actual objectification. There is a conversation about when fan service supports a show's tone versus when it distracts from it. But once that conversation gets absorbed into a culture war content, nuance dies immediately. One side starts acting like any attractive female character is automatically goon bait. The other side starts acting like any criticism of sexualized framing is an attack on sexuality itself. And both sides become useless because this character design feels overly sexualized for the tone of the show is a valid criticism. This shot is distracting from the emotional point of the scene is a valid criticism. This show is using sex appeal as part of its aesthetic identity is also a valid observation. But they hate straight sexuality is not criticism. That's content farming. Keep in mind, the guy who made that video makes a video a fucking day. I hate grifters, if you haven't noticed. This is exactly why terms like goon bait become dangerous when they get overused. Because instead of helping people describe a specific problem, the term becomes a weapon. People stop asking, is this show using fan service in a meaningful or a distracting way? And they start asking, which side are you on? That is death for actual criticism. Because now, if you say the design is fine, people assume you're defending horny bait. If you say the framing is weird, people assume you're anti-sex. Nobody is talking about the actual work anymore. They're talking about the identity politics that they projected onto the work. And for indie creators, that is a nightmare. Because imagine spending years trying to make a cartoon, and within days, the conversation around it turns into strangers arguing about whether your character's armpit is destroying Western civilization. At that point, you're not even receiving criticism anymore. You're being drafted into someone else's content war. And honestly, this is where a lot of animation discourse feels weirdly infantilized. People want adult animation. They want creator-owned, edgier work. They want indie projects that escape corporate sanitized sludge. But the second a cartoon woman has a body, suddenly everybody starts acting like the existence of sex appeal is a societal emergency on both sides. That doesn't mean that every fan servicey choice is good. It just means that the critique has to be more specific than woman hot, show bad. Because a character can be attractive without being worthless. A show can be horny without being empty. A serious scene can have distracting visual choices without the whole project being goon bait. And a pilot can use fan service as part of its identity while still needing to prove that there is more underneath it. There's just one guy with a Lord Dominator profile pic from Wander Over Yonder on Twitter who has just been going over every Planetronika post and just shitting on it, and he gets like 1 like, 0 likes, 2 likes, 1 like, 0 likes. And it gets to a point where sometimes you don't serve any purpose. And this is a prime example of one of those people who don't serve purpose in life. You breathing the same air as me is a fucking embarrassment.
What reason does a nigga like that have to live? Absolutely no reason. You're on Earth for literally no fucking reason.
So is indie animation becoming infantilized? Yes, I think so. But from both directions. Critics infantilize indie animation when they treat anything colorful, comedic, episodic, sexy, unserious, or toyetic like it automatically lacks artistic value. Defenders infantilize indie animation when they act like any critique is cruelty because the creator worked really hard. So the medium gets trapped. People want indie animation to be taken seriously, but the second it gets treated seriously enough to critique, fans act like criticism is abuse. That is not respect, that's babying. If indie animation is a passion project, then its production scale should be understood. Both things can be true. That's the part people keep refusing to hold in their heads at the same time. Indie animation is not automatically above critique because it is independent, but it should also not be reviewed with the same assumptions you'd bring to Disney, Netflix, DreamWorks, Illumination, or Amazon. When a giant corporation makes something lazy, that laziness is usually tied to massive systems. Executive decisions, shareholder logic, risk aversion, market testing, branding, licensing, franchise management. When an indie creator makes something flawed, that flaw may come from time, from money, staff size, burnout, inexperience, personal taste, or the fact that they are literally building the plane midair. But it changes how you talk about it. And this is also why I think it's unfair to put Planetronika and Gameoverse on the exact same level. Because unless I'm missing something major, Planetronika was made by 6 fucking people total, including the voice actors and the musical talent. Including those. Raphael, the creator, said the pilot took about 8 months straight to make. He also mentioned that it was pretty challenging because he's still learning other techniques in software and didn't know how to speed up the process with things like Blender or 2D rigging. That changes the entire conversation. This was a tiny team, next to no budget, and a creator still figuring out the pipeline while actively making the thing. So yes, I can critique the pacing. I can say the episode could have used a beginning, middle, and end. But if we're talking about production context, I am absolutely grading that on a different curve than something coming out of Glitch. That does not mean the pilot is immune to criticism. I literally just criticized the pacing and story structure. But when a project is being made by that small of a group, in that short of a production window, with that little infrastructure, the flaws feel different. The limitations feel different. The scale of forgiveness is different. Meanwhile, Gameoverse is coming through Glitch. A studio, while still being independent, has a much larger pipeline, a massive built-in audience, and at least dozens of people involved. And beyond that, the idea of Gameoverse has apparently been conceptualized and pitched over the course of 17 years. That does not make Gameoverse bad. That does not mean the people working on it didn't care, but it does mean I am going to hold it to a different standard, because if one project is a small group trying to build a very specific cartoon vision of life, which is honestly more of a proof of concept than it is a pilot in my opinion, and the other is backed by one of the biggest names in modern indie animation with a far more developed production ecosystem, I'm not going to critique them with the same weight. Both pilots have good qualities. Indie animation does not need babying, it needs literacy. This is where Glitch comes in, because Glitch has changed the expectations around indie animation. Glitch is not some random bedroom animator posting a rough proof of concept anymore. It has become one of the faces of modern indie animation and its boom in the modern day. The Amazing Digital Circus, Murder Drones, and Glitch's whole YouTube first model have made indie animation look mainstream to the average viewer. And that changes the viewer contract. When Gameoverse drops under Glitch, people are not watching it like some guy finally uploaded his passion project, but the average viewer is watching it like the next major entry in a professional indie animation ecosystem. And that creates pressure. Not always fair pressure, but understandable pressure. That's genuinely exciting, but it also creates a dangerous new problem. Indie creators are inheriting mainstream expectations without always having mainstream protection. The bigger indie animation gets, the more people will treat it like a product. But the more personal it remains, the more painful that treatment becomes. That's why this conversation feels so heated. People are not just reacting to one pilot, they're reacting to what they think indie animation is becoming. And in Glitch's case specifically, the expectation is different because the brand has already proven that indie animation can operate at a scale that feels almost impossible compared to what the internet used to consider indie. So when people see Gameoverse, they're not just seeing a passion project, they're seeing a project released through a studio pipeline that already has massive cultural momentum behind it. Again, that does not mean people should become disrespectful, and it does not mean they should treat the crew like faceless corporate machinery. But it does mean the criticism is naturally going to carry more weight than it would for a tiny independent pilot released by a 6-person team. And if indie animation keeps growing, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, because the phrase indie animation is starting to describe projects with wildly different scales. A solo animator posting a 5-minute proof of concept, a 6-person team making a pilot with voice actors included in the count, a mid-sized internet studio with a massive audience and a professional pipeline, a creator-owned project getting distribution through Netflix while still premiering on YouTube. Those are not the same thing. They might all be indie in the sense that they are not traditional corporate studio products, but they are not equal in resources, visibility, risk, or expectation. So if we're going to criticize indie animation seriously, we need to be able to tell the difference. Once a fandom forms around an indie project, fans start acting like stakeholders. They don't just watch anymore, they campaign. They moralize, they leak, they punish creators for not validating their theories. They turn disappointment into betrayal. They mistake access for ownership. There's also been a slight bit of controversy around Raphael Naya, the creator of Planetronika, blocking an insane amount of people on Twitter, many of whom, from what I've seen, never interacted with him directly at all. And I want to be fair here, to my knowledge, this was a blockchain, not him sitting at his computer personally banishing the shit out of everyone who had personally disagreed with his whatever. But even that situation speaks to a larger issue, because once discourse around your project starts spreading, the creator has to decide what kind of access people are allowed to have to them. And I know that blocking people can look extreme from the outside, but also if you're an indie creator and your work suddenly becomes the subject of quote tweets, horny arguments, goon bait accusations, bad faith criticism, genuine criticism, fan defenses, and people arguing over whether your passion project deserves to exist, I understand why someone would want to close the door before a room catches fire. It doesn't mean creators should avoid all criticism, but it does show why boundaries are not optional anymore. Because fandom access can turn into emotional surveillance very quickly. And the second a creator starts explaining every decision, defending every scene, reacting to every thread, correcting every fan theory, and over-justifying every creative choice, they begin training the fandom to expect that level of access. And that's dangerous. Creators need to decide early what feedback they listen to, what feedback they ignore, what they clarify, what they refuse to explain. What parts of the story are non-negotiable? What criticism is useful? What criticism is just anxiety wearing a media literacy costume? Because if creators don't set that boundary, the audience will try to become the writer's room. A fandom can support a show, but the second it starts trying to parent the show, the creator has to close that door. And I don't mean creators should become arrogant. I don't mean they should ignore all feedback. I don't mean that they should hide behind, you just don't understand the vision, every time someone points a real issue. But I do mean this. The audience can tell you what they felt. They cannot tell you what your story is allowed to be. So where does that leave us? The real problem is not that indie animation fans are too mean or too soft. The real problem is that nobody is applying the same standard consistently. People will look at a 6-person passion project and demand airtight professional pacing, then look at a larger studio-backed project and defend every flaw like criticism is illegal. Or they'll do the opposite. They'll excuse everything under the word indie even when the project is being released by one of the most visible animation studios on the internet. That's not criticism. That is vibe-based morality. It's vibe-based. One side treats indie pilots like failed corporate products. The other side treats criticism like an attack on someone's soul. But indie animation exists in the middle. It's a personal work being released into a public marketplace. So yeah, it deserves real criticism, but that criticism has to understand what the work is, what stage it's in, what resources it has, and what it's actually trying to accomplish. Gameoverse and Planetronika should not be immune to criticism just because they are indie, but they also should not be judged like they are corporate, soulless products made by giant studios with infinite money. The standard should be, did this pilot make a clear promise? Did it execute that promise well? And did it give me a reason to care about what comes next? That is the cleaner framework. Because the conversation stops being this is peak versus this is trash. It becomes what was this trying to do and how well did it do it? That's actual criticism. Audiences need to learn how to critique pilots as pilots. Creators need to stop over-explaining themselves to people who are never going to engage in good faith. Fans need to stop using passion project as a shield against all criticism. Critics need to stop using "I didn't personally like this" as proof that a project is objectively worthless or trying to form it into a moral argument. Because, you know, Twitter loves to be right. People need to separate production limitations from writing problems. People need to separate fan service from actual porn-brained storytelling. People need to stop confusing access with ownership. And creators need to build boundaries before the fandom decides it owns the direction of the work. For the goon bait argument, define the term before applying it. What is goon bait? And as for the culture war argument, shut the fuck up. Because the second goon bait becomes the war against straight sexuality, the conversation is no longer about animation. It's about people using indie art as fuel for whatever politics they already wanted to have, and they're just using ammo to back it up. And creators need to recognize that early, because not every loud conversation about your work is actually about your work. At the end of the day, the final question is, are we criticizing the work, or are we punishing it for not being the version we wanted it to be? This framework lets people talk about indie animation without turning every conversation into either blind defense or blind hatred. It gives creators permission to take critique seriously without being ruled by it. It gives audiences permission to criticize indie work without pretending scale and context don't matter. And it makes the conversation more useful for anyone trying to build original stories online. Because indie animation is growing up. It's kind of in its adolescent phase. But the fandom around it has not fully learned to grow with it. I think people want creator-owned animation to be the future, but they are still using old habits from corporate fandom, stan culture, culture war bait, and algorithm discourse to talk about it. If I see another nerd-erotic style video on my feed, I'm fucking roasting somebody. It's like people want creators to have freedom, but they also want their own personal expectations treated like obligations. They want originality, but punish creators when originality doesn't arrive in the exact shape they imagined. And that contradiction is going to keep hurting the medium if people don't get smarter about critique. And honestly, that's why this whole conversation needs more maturity, because Planetronika can have an incredible aesthetic and still have pacing problems. Gameoverse can still have a strong conceptual hook and still have heavy-handed writing. A character can be attractive without the entire project being goon bait. A pilot can be flawed without being worthless. A creator can set boundaries without being above critique. And an audience can criticize something without acting like the creator personally failed them. That is the actual adult conversation here. Not indie animation good, not indie animation bad, right? Not this pilot didn't fulfill my exact fantasy, therefore it sucks. The real question is, are we judging the work based on what it is actually trying to do, with an understanding of the scale it was made under, or are we using indie animation as another excuse to argue about our own expectations? The future of indie animation will not just depend on better animation from a technical standpoint, it will not just depend on better writing, it will not just depend on better funding, it will depend on healthier boundaries between creators and the people who love their work. And this connects to me because this is exactly why I think about the topic so much as someone making original comics. Because the second you put a personal project online, people stop treating it like something that came from your life and start treating it like a public service that exists to satisfy them. And as much as creators need audiences, we cannot let audiences become the authority over why the work exists. Criticism can help the work grow, but entitlement can make the creator disappear. And I think that's the real fear underneath all of this. Not that people will criticize your work, but that people will look at something you spent years building, something that came from your taste, your influences, your pain, your humor, your imagination, and your actual life, and reduce it to whether or not it satisfied their personal content appetite in 7 minutes or in 30 minutes. That does not mean you get to reject every critique. It means you need discernment. You need to know the difference between someone pointing out a flaw and someone demanding ownership. You need to know the difference between a viewer being confused because your setup failed and a viewer being impatient because they want the entire show immediately. You need to know the difference between fan service as a style choice and fan service as the entire point. You need to know the difference between protecting your vision and hiding it from feedback. That is the survival skill now. Not just animation, not just writing, not just marketing, boundaries. Because indie animation is not small anymore, you know what I mean? Creator-owned work is not invisible anymore. We have the platforms in this internet age to take something that we created, in the comfort of our own homes and blow it up to 1 million view status. We can do that. And so once we drop our work into the wild, part of it stops becoming our work, in the sense that you cannot control how people perceive it, but you can control what you take from it and how that fandom affects you. Because the thing is, a creator is not your employee, a fandom is not a writer's room, and if you want more videos about building original stories, indie comics, animation, fandom culture, and the ugly side of putting your work online, I think you would like this video about handling critique as a creator.